Part 5, End of a Long March, Chapter 15, Movement Veterans Adjust to Civilian Life. Tens of thousands of people passed through the new communist movement between the late 1960s and 1990. Many of them became cadre and subordinated nearly every aspect of their lives to collectively determined political priorities. For some, joining the movement coincided with their initial radicalization. For others, mainly individuals who had turned leftward in the 1960s, party building did not play the same role in first forming their political identities. But since a large proportion of these 1960s activists assumed leadership positions, their Marxist-Leninist years still stood out as the most self-conscious political involvement of their lives. By the 1990s, the bulk of movement organizations had shriveled or disappeared. Less than 1,000 people remained in movement-descended groups, and a high proportion of these were newer recruits. The vast majority of activists who had built the movement in its heyday were no longer involved. At different times between 1979 to 1980 and 1989-90, these veterans had withdrawn from participation in a Leninist cadre organization and faced the challenges of adjusting to civilian life. Contrasts with the 1950s. For thousands, the change was a wrenching one. The first challenge was rethinking political perspectives and commitments. Do I still consider myself on the left? What do I make of my experience, and what kind of activism, if any, do I want to pursue from here? Frequently, this transition was accompanied by ideological confusion, emotional strain, and psychological anxiety, especially since the majority of ex-cadre did not go through any systematic summation of their experience with supportive comrades. Many veterans experienced something resembling post-traumatic stress syndrome. Feelings ran the gamut from an acute sense of having lost something precious to profound bitterness. Most movement veterans retained an allegiance to progressive ideas, but few turned to other organized socialist projects. The typical ex-cadre's level of activism declined substantially, and a large number stepped back completely from political involvement for at least some period of time. In many respects, the stories from this generation paralleled those from an earlier exodus from communism, the withdrawal of tens of thousands from the CPUSA in the mid-1950s. But there were crucial differences in the circumstances these two generations faced. First, the 1980s did not see anything like the McCarthyist witch hunts of the 1950s. Reagan and the New Right certainly worked to whip up anti-communist sentiment, and the 1980s were full of repressive measures. But no House Un-American Activities Committee issued subpoenas against every current and former Marxist-Leninist in sight, and no judges presided over latter-day Smith Act trials in which prison terms loomed over people's heads. Still, any communism did make it a distinct disadvantage for activists to be open about their one-time Marxist-Leninist affiliations. Activists might not have to worry much about by-agents knocking at the door, but a measure of discrimination and social stigma could easily follow an individual, blocking access to one or another position in the labor movement or the progressive nonprofit milieu, as well the business or professional world. Concerns about such inequities remain to this day and are the main reason that individuals' names have been used so sparingly in this book. Second, the new communist movement had never attained the strength of the CPUSA during its heyday. Movement veterans did not share the ex-CP members' trauma of losing a party that had influenced millions and held undisputed hegemony on the left for more than 2 decades. Most had also functioned as cadre for a shorter period than their 1930s-1940s CPUSA counterparts. True, many of those radicalized in the 1960s had seen themselves as revolutionaries for 20 years, virtually their entire adult lives, but for many this earlier phase of activism actually eased the readjustment process, since they were able to reconnect with networks of 1960s activists with whom they had once severed ties because of ideological differences. And many circles of activists from the 1960s or very early 1970s, for example veterans of IS&CC SDS, or the Young Lords, found themselves re-establishing their ties, including via a series of reunions, and attaining a measure of recognition and respect from the broader society. Third, the movement's collapse was not bound up with any single event comparable to Khrushchev's 1956 revelations about Stalin, with its bombshell impact on a generation of communists worldwide. Party-building veterans as a group did not go through anything of comparable depth and scope. Some were taken aback by smaller-scale revelations about the ways in which organizational leaders had abused their authority. Others were shaken when they faced up to the butchery of Pol Pot or the atrocities committed during China's Cultural Revolution. But for the most part, the corruption of movement leaders was run-of-the-mill, comparable to the miserable standard of mainstream organizations. or for that matter, abuses of power in academia, the trade union movement, or the nonprofit world. And while the horrors of Pol Pot and self-righteous Red Guards were real enough, few party builders had the same deep-seated emotional attachment to Kampuchea or China that 1930s-1940s CPUSA members had for the US SAR. As a result, feelings of disgust, disillusion, and betrayal tended to be shallower and less widespread, and far less projected before the general public than they were among ex-CPUSA members in the 1950s. But then so were positive feelings of pride or nostalgia. Some people certainly felt deceived and angry, but the factors that turned such sentiments into a God that failed public spectacle of confession and denunciation in the 1950s did not exist. By and large, those who felt bitter about their years in the movement nursed their grievances in private and did not translate them into a conservative political outlook. The majority remained, if not activists, at least on the progressive end of the spectrum, earning a living. Meanwhile, day-to-day life presented serious challenges. One task was figuring out how to earn a living and organize a personal or family life, matters previously subordinated to political concerns. On leaving the movement, most individuals were between 30 and 45 years old, and especially those abandoning activism altogether compared their situations to those of generational peers who had not immersed themselves in any disciplined movement. With once strong organizational bonds now removed, matters of class and racial background frequently came to the fore. The relatively high proportion of veterans from the middle classes, mainly white, tended to compare their situations with people they had known in high school or college. Many of these, including 1960s protesters who had not become communists, had already spent a decade obtaining advanced degrees, developing professional careers, establishing a family, and so on. All this while Leninist cadre had toiled in factory jobs or worked for the movement at subsistence wages, postponed having children to leave time for revolutionary work, and let their personal lives suffer under the strain of an intense cadre culture. Many ex-cadre, even those who retained a commitment to the left, decided that their first priority was to catch up in the career and family aspects of life. Thus the 1980s saw one small wave after another of former cadre leaving factories, secretaries, and clerks' desks or part-time jobs. Many went back to school to get college or graduate degrees. Likewise, the 1980s saw many new pairings and an activist mini-baby boom. Because many other 1960s activists and participants in the counterculture had also postponed career and family establishment, and because this broader set substantially outnumbered the former Marxist-Leninists, this communist return to the mainstream was not identified as a distinct phenomenon. Rather, it was tucked into a broader return to the fold of so many prodigal sons and daughters of the 1960s. Despite starting careers later than many others their age, veterans from middle-class backgrounds had several assets. Most had developed valuable skills while in the movement: public speaking, writing, teaching, administration, and organizing and leading people. Many had made or were able to re-establish connections with progressive-minded people who were already several steps up various career ladders. As a result, a large proportion succeeded in re-entering the better-off strata from which they had once defected. Veterans from poorer working-class backgrounds, like their non-activist class peers, faced more complex challenges. One subset of this group, individuals recruited to Marxist-Leninist organizations directly at the point of production or out of working class and people of color neighborhoods, had been least likely to change their jobs or living situations due to organizational mandate. For the most part, they had stayed in place to organize their co-workers, even if they had simultaneously been given leadership training and responsibilities. These activists were closely tuned into the practical results of their organization's efforts, and they tended to be the first to leave when a group started to decline. In these cases, an individual's natural trajectory would be to continue to earn a living in the same way they had before joining the movement. Many followed this path. Yet for many workers, participation in the communist movement had provided horizon-broadening interactions with new ideas and with people of very different class and racial backgrounds. And once class emancipation through revolution seemed to be off the agenda, this frequently translated into an expanded sense of individual career possibilities. In the 1980s era of plant closures, runaway shops, and a resurgence of racism, this might mean attempting to take a different path than that of other workers who saw their jobs moved out from under them. Some individuals reached their goals, buoyed by skills learned, talents unleashed, and contacts made within the movement. But even for those who made it, the road was rocky. Harsh economic realities under Reagan meant that a lot more workers of all political persuasions and racial backgrounds found their employment prospects and income levels going downward rather than upward during the course of the 1980s. The majority of cadre from working-class backgrounds had not been recruited right off the factory floor. Rather, they were youth who had had the chance to attend college during the late 1960s, early 1970s boom in working-class enrollment, where they were young, mainly non-white, and drawn into the movement via the upsurge in the Black, Asian, Chicano, and Puerto Rican communities. While lacking the resources of their middle-class comrades, these individuals matched them in terms of learning skills and making connections. Though it remained a greater challenge for these individuals to launch themselves on a middle-class professional career, many who chose that path were able to overcome the obstacles before them, meshing into the progressive milieu. Meanwhile, at the intersection of the how do I make a living and what will be my political involvement questions, veterans of all backgrounds found opportunities unavailable to ex-peers in the 1950s in the progressive milieu of the 1980s and 1990s, with its dense network of nonprofit advocacy, educational and service groups, research institutes, publications, cultural centers, and community organizations. These offered jobs where many of the skills that cadre had learned as Marxist-Leninists were directly applicable. Though there were cases where an individual suffered hiring discrimination because of his or her past, these tended to be exceptions. Likewise, on campuses there was an academic left within which ex-cadre could find a niche. Here too, having been a member of a Marxist-Leninist group was not an automatic bar to employment, or included mysterious gaps, might not be as well received as that of the recent PhD who had followed a traditional academic path. Even more important, labor movement officialdom was beginning to undergo both a generational and political shift. Positions on local union staffs and even the staffs of a few internationals were opening up to people in their 30s and 40s who had been rank-and-file oppositionists in the 1970s, so were elected union posts. And in contrast to the 1950s, a communist past did not automatically prevent an individual from being elected by co-workers or hired by a new union president or executive board. Even in electoral politics there were openings, especially for majority people of color districts. Progressive candidates were winning offices and ex-cadre were well positioned to serve as aides or to win local office themselves. With the collapse of most movement organizations, these openings were extremely attractive. In particular, the changing contours of the left gave the progressive nonprofit world far greater weight than it had previously had, as the 1980s preceded the kind of volunteer activist-based organizations that had predominated during the 1960s and 1970s receded, and staff-run foundation-supported paper membership organizations became the norm. This shift in part reflected an adaptation to conditions of reduced popular insurgency and grassroots involvement, but it also reflected the increased influence of liberal foundations and individual philanthropists. Despite their limitations, jobs in nonprofits, as well as within labor, electoral politics, and academia, provided a way for movement veterans to simultaneously make a living and stay politically involved. These institutions also provided reference points for individuals not employed by them, a place to send an annual check, subscribe to a newsletter, attend an event. Overall, most ex-party builders did not retreat completely into private life or transfer allegiance to any anti-left political trend. Rather, they gradually and almost invisibly meshed into the country's amorphous progressive milieu. Beyond a general left-leaning outlook, little united the former party builders. Evaluations of the movement's experience ranged all over the map, so did opinions about current-day strategy. Particularly striking was how few former cadre connected with other socialist groups or tried to reconstruct the socialist left as such. To an extent, this simply mirrored the general tendency among 1980s leftists to hold on to socialism as a private belief while considering it futile to attempt any revival of a socialist movement. Numerous factors accounted for such sentiment: disillusionment with the experience of the countries that had tried to build socialism, disappointment at the failures of U.S. socialist and communist parties, a perception, undoubtedly correct, that socialism was not on the near-term U.S. agenda, and doubts about the viability of a socialist project only increased following the Tiananmen Square massacre and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The thinking of ex-party builders reflected these elements, but was also shaped by their experience in a movement that essentially regarded the socialist movement as identical with one's own particular vanguard. In this framework, the communist vanguard embodied socialism, and building the socialist movement and building the party were considered one and the same thing. To the extent that the existence of a broader socialist left was even acknowledged, it was almost always dealt with by intense criticism of all its non-party components as opportunists. Activists shaped by this outlook tended to equate the collapse of their particular party with the collapse of any possibility or desirability of building a socialist left. The pull toward hooking up with some other socialist trend or group was also weakened by the feebleness of most of the socialist organizations that existed in the 1980s and 1990s. Marxist-Leninist veterans were used to functioning in disciplined, multiracial, get-things-done organizations. For all their faults, these were capable of carrying out ambitious and coordinated campaigns. In contrast, the socialist left of the 1980s and 1990s was dominated by social democratic groups that could not mobilize their overwhelmingly white memberships to engage in any sustained practical activity. Even movement veterans who had become convinced that hierarchical leadership and near-monolithic unity must be dispensed with found it hard to believe that much could be accomplished by such formations. And the alternative of starting over, trying to build new organizations that rejected sectarianism while functioning with a high level of collectivity and activism, held little appeal for a set of ex-cadre who were in their 40s, reeling from years of internecine warfare, and faced with daunting new political realities. The fact is that most veterans were suffering from battle fatigue. While individuals naturally differed in their energy levels, on the whole ex-party builders manifested all the scars inflicted by political defeat. These are not limited to exhaustion and confusion, but extend to a psychological emotional wariness of ever committing oneself so deeply or making such sacrifices again. Not every individual felt defeated in terms of the concrete struggles they had waged. Many felt pride in having contributed to one or another successful reform or defensive struggle, and numerous veterans whose activism stretched back to the 1960s retained an ineradicable sense of accomplishment at having helped stop the Vietnam War and struck deep blows against racism. But on the level of rebuilding a revolutionary movement, most realized that they had failed, and virtually all exhibited the political and psychological symptoms of this defeat. This is the fundamental reason why only a small percentage were prepared to throw themselves into the various 1980s or early 1990s attempts to revitalize U.S. socialism. A far larger number of the ex-party builders remained stalwarts of progressive mass activism, especially in the trade unions and in communities of color, where the new communist movement had concentrated its attention. Ex-cadre active in the labor movement include individuals who worked in factories, hospitals, or offices before they joined a Marxist-Leninist group, as well as ex-students who entered workplaces as colonizers. Some stayed in these workplaces after the movement's collapse out of political conviction or because they had acquired paid union posts, others simply out of personal preference or because they believed it was too late for them to find a different way to make a living. Almost all had acquired valuable skills, and many had won the respect of co-workers. The efforts of these veterans made a substantial contribution to the slow but steady political shift in labor that gathered steam through the 1980s, and in 1995 led to the election of the John Sweeney-led New Voice slate to head the AFL-CIO. In turn, these activists took advantage of the greater opportunity the shift provided to attain influential union positions. Ex-party builders have won election to local and regional union offices and serve on the staffs of union locals and internationals, city, state, and regional labor councils, and the AFL-CIO itself. The influence of former cadre is also felt in numerous worker organizing projects that are not part of the official labor movement. Often called worker centers, several of these groups have done groundbreaking work, especially in organizing immigrant workers and workers of color, and enforcing issues of anti-racism, defense of immigrant rights, and rank-and-file democracy onto labor's agenda. Ex-cadre also are active in university labor studies departments and in research and advocacy institutes that focus on workers' rights. The ex-party building contingent in and around the labor movement does not advance a common strategy or function as a unified group, though some subsets of it, usually clusters of old comrades, consult with and support each other, but the aggregate efforts of these many ex-cadre, and of the few individuals who remain members of movement-descended organizations, have been an important factor in the still-in-progress leftward shift in labor. In communities of color, former Marxist-Leninists can be found in the full range of organizations taking on political, economic, and social issues. Likewise, many white ex-cadre devote their energies to anti-racist struggles and participate in multiracial organizations that give high priority to fighting racism. Former party builders are involved in immigrant rights organizations, anti-repression, anti-police violence, and prisoners' rights campaigns, efforts to build unity among different communities of color, and the growing movement against environmental racism. They provide a number of the radical voices in both the mainstream and independent media oriented to minority communities, and are represented within ethnic studies departments, and are frequently immersed in progressive activity among faculty and students of color. Ex-cadre are active in groups focusing on education, as both teachers and parents have been elected to local school boards and have attained high positions in city and state educational administrations. They are participants in struggles against homelessness and the slashing of the social safety net, in organizations and campaigns addressing the particular needs and demands of women of color, and in fights for healthcare reform. Relatively intact circles of activists from some groups, especially LREs and CWP, self-consciously entered electoral politics before these groups collapsed, and several ex-cadre of these organizations, as well as other groups, have won elected office in areas with significant people of color populations. Activists with Marxist-Leninist histories are immersed in the spurt of 1990s efforts to regroup and revive a left wing within particular communities of color. The most ambitious of these is the Black Radical Congress, but the Asian American Left Forum and New Reza Left are also worthy of note. Ex-party builders can also be found in radical professional and academic organizations such as the National Lawyers Guild and the Union for Radical Political Economics, in peace and solidarity campaigns and the women's movement, in community organizing projects and in the artistic and cultural spheres, even within the gay and lesbian movements, which during the 1970s were the target of so much movement homophobia. Former Marxist-Leninists have become respected participants. Altogether, hundreds of former cadre wield influence within particular constituencies, movements, or struggles. These veterans are a potential reservoir of support for a revitalized U.S. left, should motion in that direction begin to gather steam. As refugees from a defeated political current, they are unlikely to play a leading role in that task, though they have a rich legacy of experience to contribute. But in contrast to 30 years ago, they will make their contributions as individuals, not as part of a collective effort with a common vision of how to change the world.